Hello, Friendly Man here once again, and I'm here to tell you that I'm sorry. I know I said I was going to do a video once a week, but I had a little problem. My computer caught a virus, and it destroyed all out of programs like the editing software that I use to make videos and stuff like that. So that's the reason why I didn't do it. Very sorry about that. But I still do want to put Weapons of Chess online for you guys to watch. So here's the book. If you can actually go and buy this book, it will be actually better for you, because then you can read along with it, and then you can see the positions a little bit clearer. So that's all I want to say to you. Keep on coming back to this channel, and there'll be some more videos. Thank you very much.
Double pawns, two pawns of the same color that occupy the same file. The result of a capture by one of them are called doubled pawns. Connected or isolated. In diagram 44, doubled C pawns will be created when black's D pawn captures white's knight. Black gets doubled C pawns. Doubled pawns may be connected or isolated. Connected doubled pawns have at least one friendly pawn occupying an adjacent file. This pawn could be an important protector for the doubled pawns. A doubled pawn can be your friend. In diagram 45, for example, black can save the doubled c5 pawn from the CL rook's threatened capture by defending it with the adjoining b pawn, moving it to b6. Black's b pawn can protect the c pawn. Doubled pawns can be isolated, without a friendly adjacent pawn to offer protection. Such pawns are separated from friendly pawns by at least one file, or they lie along the board's edge. In diagram 46, black has isolated doubled pawns on the B and H files. Similarly, white has doubled pawns on the D and G files. Doubled pawns tend to be unfavorable because they can be weak, difficult to defend, or subject to enemy attack, especially if they are immobile. But if they can't be attacked, they aren't necessarily weak. Not realizing that, chess novices often go out of their way to avoid doubling their pawns, even to the extent of marring, for pairs of doubled isolated pawns, their position in other ways. Just remember that doubled pawns aren't necessarily disastrous. Weigh the good and bad points of the exchange that creates them to make an objective decision. But there are times when doubled pawns do lead to tactical problems, such as when they expose your king's position. They also may result in an unfavorably unbalanced pawn structure in which the enemy can derive a winning pawn majority on one side, or in one sector of the board. Doubled pawns may lead to an isolated pawn. Moreover, a side effect of doubled pawns is often the isolation of another friendly pawn, as in the exchange leading to the doubled pawns shown in diagram 47. In this position, black's doubled c pawns resulted when a white knight moved from d4 and was traded for a black knight on c6. When white captured black's knight, black took back on c6 with the b7 pawn. An exchange on c6 has created an isolated black a pawn. Those doubled c pawns are not necessarily bad for black, unless white can successfully attack and exploit them. In fact, by bringing the b7 pawn to c6, black has increased his strength in the center. Suddenly the key d5 square is guarded by the c6 doubled pawn. Now white can't safely occupy d5 with a knight or any other piece. On the other hand, the exchange has created an isolated a pawn that can no longer be guarded by one of its brothers. If the a pawn is ever attacked, black will have to defend it with a piece, which then becomes rather passive. Furthermore, with the b7 pawn having moved to c6, the squares a6 and a5 can no longer be guarded by a black pawn and may become vulnerable to occupation by white pieces. A breached wall. Some tactical problems involved in accepting doubled pawns are illustrated in diagram 48. White is saddled with doubled f pawns, a result of the exchange of a black knight on g5 for a white knight on f3. To avoid losing material, white had to recapture with a g2 pawn, which ended up on f3. This has seriously compromised the white king's position, for the g-pawn is no longer shielding the king. Black can capitalize on the gap immediately, moving his queen from d8 to g5, giving check. After white's king escapes to high, black's queen creeps to g4, attacking white's f3 pawn. The f3 pawn, pinned to white's king at high by the bishop at d5, can't escape. Once black's queen and bishop together bear down on the f3 pawn, white must sacrifice his queen to stop mate, because black's bishop will capture the f3 pawn with check, setting up a mate threat at g2. Doubled pawns and pawn majorities, an exchange that yields doubled pawns, can also lead to the creation of a winning breakthrough or pawn majority. This is shown in diagram 49. White exchanges and breaks through. In this position, white wins by first exchanging bishops on f6. White captures black's bishop with check, and black recaptures with his e7 pawn, doubling the f-pawns. White now has a winning imbalance, a queenside majority of 2 pawns to 1. He can push through his d-pawn, protected by the c5 pawn, and make a new queen in a few moves, or white could first move the c-pawn to c6, then advance the d-pawn. Depending on black's response, either white's c-pawn or d-pawn must queen. The doubled pawns in this example were not in themselves a problem. But with the e7 pawn drawn out of position, white gained a winning pawn advantage on the c and d files. To double or not to double, should you ever permit the doubling of your own pawns? Is it ever an advantage to accept them? Sometimes there is no practical choice, you accept either bled pawns or some other disadvantage, such as loss of time or material. In diagram 50, for example, if white's knight captures black's h6 bishop, giving check, black has no choice but to take back with his g7 pawn. If he doesn't, for fear of exposing his king's position, and instead moves his king to the corner, white will then retreat his knight to safety, remaining a piece ahead. White doubles black's pawns, which is worse, to slightly weaken your king's position or to lose a knight? Most of the time, losing a knight means certain defeat, while accepting a busted pawn structure may still allow considerable resistance. In fact, you might not even lose at all. Allow it or be mated. Sometimes an absurd example points out a logical fallacy, as in diagram 51. Should black avoid doubled pawns or male while? It is black's move. White threatens, whenever feasible, to capture black's bishop on c6 with his knight. To keep material equality, black would have to take back on c6 with the pawn on d7, accepting doubled c-pawns. Should black avoid this by moving the bishop out of the range of white's knight? Or should black give checkmate by moving his knight from g5 to 3? The correct answer, obviously, is to give mate. But in many, almost equally obvious examples, a player fails to look at even aspect of the position and plays as if the opponent's threat is the only consideration. Scrutinize the position carefully. It may contain a possibility that dwarfs the drawbacks of your opponent's potential threat. Accepting doubled pawns. One reason to accept doubled pawns is to obtain an open file for your rook to exploit, as in diagram 52. Black's last move, the advance of the a-pawn from a5 to a4, assailed white's knight at b3. White could move the b3 knight out of attack, perhaps to d2. In pushing the a-pawn, black wasn't worried that white would play an inch between move and capture the knight on f6 with the bishop before moving the knight to safety. Though capturing the f6 knight forces the doubling of black's f-pawns and the isolation of black's h-pawn, it also opens the g-file for occupation by black's rooks, meaning that white would be faced with 2 threats, not just one. The knight on b3 would still be attacked, and mate along the g-file would also be threatened by a black rook moving to g8. Pursue your own game. As you see, sometimes you may want to put off responding to enemy threats in order to implement an idea of your own. But if you decide to postpone defending for a move or two, make sure that after your opponent responds to your idea, you will still have, black doesn't fear the doubled f-pawns, enough time to answer his original threat. Take special care to see that the response to your in-between move will not add new threats. You might not be able to handle two threats with a single move. There may be many reasons to allow the weakening of your pawn structure, but the only good ones give you advantages that outweigh any weaknesses you incur. Remember, isolated doubled pawns tend to be weaker than connected doubled pawns because, if attacked, they must be guarded by pieces. But sometimes doubled isolated pawns can be quite useful, as in the next example. Beware tactical threats. White's doubled c-pawns guard key squares. In diagram 53, black's last move was to advance the c-pawn from c6 to c5, a tactical error that leads to the loss of a pawn. White's knight leaps from b4 to d5, unleashing a triple attack against black's beleaguered b6 pawn. Black has no adequate way to save the pawn. It can be sufficiently protected, and if black captures the knight with the bishop on a8, white will straighten out his pawn formation by recapturing with a c4 pawn. Black will then have to guard against two threats, the double rook attack on his b6 pawn, and the d-pawns attack on the e6 knight. Because the knight is more important and must be saved, black's b-pawn falls. Of significance in this variation is that white's other c-pawn c3 guards the possible invasion point d4. Were it not for that pawn, after white's c4 pawn captures on d5, black's knight on e6 could move to d4 with check, gaining enough time to salvage the position. So, even without black's blunder, the pawn move c7 c5, white still has a positional edge because of his doubled and isolated c-pawns. The one on c4, in conjunction with the one on e4, anchors the white knight on d5 beautifully. And the pawn on c3 controls d4, preventing black's knight from assuming an aggressive central post. Good advice: to sum up, doubled pawns often tend to be weak. Sometimes, they might even constitute a chronic or tactical weakness. In some situations, however, their existence is inconsequential or even advantageous. Learn to take either side of the bet. If you see a way to saddle our opponent with doubled pawns, consider carefully whether he will be a liability or an asset. Be sure they won't help the enemy afterward. If the resulting situation would be unclear, play in a manner that will increase the likelihood that the doubletons will remain a end-term weakness. For yourself, try to avoid accepting doubled pawns if you can. Determine that your position will suffer afterward because of them, don't go out of the way to avoid them if analysis indicates that they don't matter very much in the big picture. You might make a significant gain in time or position by allowing them. You have to know this. If you are suddenly afflicted with double pawns, make the best of the situation and try to turn them into a strength. Sometimes you can do this by using the pawns as battering rams to expose or weaken your opponent's position. In other instances, you might be able to occupy the resulting open file with a major piece, thereby gaining attack advantages. Judge each situation on its own merits, not